Hope you're having a good day today. It's Wednesday. We're halfway through. So hope you're doing well wherever you may be. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Today we're going to be looking in verse 10. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 10. Let's just get over there and get right into it. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? A lot of folks want to talk about there at the beginning. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Just quickly to address that, we might look a little bit further down around verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Okay. Verse towards the end of the chapter, but she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. So I didn't really want to dwell on the idea too much that Paul is saying, well, this is just my personal opinion. This isn't from the Lord. Now, the Lord made in his mercy, he gives judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. And also he says, I think also I have the Spirit of God. So I think that's enough for that. Didn't really want to dwell on it too much, frankly. But what I did want to talk about today within our verses, let me get back up there. In those verses, to the married, verse 10 is where we began. And I wanted to look at this passage. And something struck me a little bit yesterday as we get into it. And pardon that tangent. Hate to have tangents right out of the gate, but anyway, just because I read it, thought I'd mention it. Anyway, within this passage, to the married, first thing I wanted for us to think about today is why start with verse 10? Look at that verse. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. In my opinion, it is very interesting that he does not start with a husband is not to depart from his wife. Usually, in the Gospels, for example, when the Lord is talking about divorce, and it's always a husband, it's always from the husband's perspective, because that's what society was like, I would suggest, in Israel and Judea. It's the males. It's the males who, and granted here, verse 11, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay? But it usually starts with that. Husbands, don't divorce your wife. That's not how it starts in verse 10, though. It doesn't start with husbands, don't divorce your wife. It's wives, don't depart from your husbands. Why does it start from the female perspective? I don't know if you think that's interesting or not. I do. And I wonder if the issue was, again, it was such a sexually depraved culture. So you have these folks who are becoming Christians. How many of those men would have partaken with the temple prostitutes, the temple of Aphrodite? How many of those men would have done that? A lot of them. Most of them, perhaps, if they're coming from that culture. So how many of those women in Corinth would have the scriptural right to put their husbands away and to leave their husbands? How many of those women would have that right? How many of those women had seen their husbands fooling around with these women in town as a part, even as a part of their former religion, but really it was just debauchery. How many of those, how many of these women would have the scriptural right to put away their husbands? What I want you to see is this is just the reality. This is the reality of the situation. It's amazing to me that the gospel took hold in Corinth because it was such a hotbed of different issues. So it's amazing, and we've talked about it before. That gives us hope for the culture we live in, certainly. But why start with this verse 10? This is just the reality of the situation. So when he starts off, when he starts with, within this paragraph, a wife is not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. Even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife. For one thing, Paul is not saying anything that Jesus did not say himself earlier. He's not saying anything that the Lord didn't talk about. He's not saying anything. It's not different rules for Corinth than it was for the Jews that Jesus was dealing with. That's not what he's saying. But here, what he is talking about, and more specifically, verse 12, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, she is willing to live with him. Verse 13, a woman who has a husband who does not believe. Let's look at it from this perspective. If you have a husband or a wife who does not believe, what may they still be doing in Corinth? They're not Christians. So what sort of behavior do you think they're still engaging in? It is a difficult and a hard situation, is what I'm wanting you to see. But he starts with wives. One of the points that people make about the New Testament is all of a sudden you have women who are given more. It's not an all boys club. That's how it was in times gone by. But all of a sudden in the church, there's neither male nor female, Jew or Gentile. All of a sudden, females have been elevated. And it would be real easy in the church in Corinth. It would be real easy for there to just all of a sudden be mass divorces. It would be real easy for all of a sudden just everybody just gets divorced. It was such a hotbed of sexual immorality. And I wonder if that's one of the things that Paul is addressing. He starts off, wives, a wife is not to depart from her husband. What do you think a lot of those wives were thinking? Maybe we should just put them away. Maybe we should just put them away. Mass divorces. And we'll say this. One of the points of the passage, and one of the questions, and we've already touched on some of this. You have Old Testament examples, and they're thinking maybe we need to, how many times you're coming out of paganism. How many times does the whole family come at the same time? How many times does a husband and wife come at the same time? What happens pretty often is a wife might obey, but a husband doesn't. A husband might obey, but a wife doesn't. And all of a sudden it starts creating a lot of friction in the marriage because you have one who's trying to please the Lord and you have the other one who's frankly trying to please himself or herself, whatever the case may be. So he's worried about mass divorces. We'll also say this. Look back at the passage, and I want to back up a little bit to chapter 6. We didn't touch on something, but I want you to back up to chapter 6 in that list of some of the sexual immorality that was happening. I'll get there eventually. Specifically verse 9. The unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites. For one thing, why is idolatry mentioned in that? It's because sexual immorality was a part of their idolatry. I would suggest that's why it's listed there. But you have different versions of sexual immorality. Fornication is not the same thing as adultery. And what I want you to see, homosexuals nor sodomites. This is where that word there for homosexuals, the King James uses the word effeminate, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind. And someone asked me recently, well, why does it list, why doesn't it just say the sexually immoral? Well, it's because there's different versions of sexual immorality, frankly. And we could get more graphic about it, but that's enough to say that. We've said that to say this. Husbands could have been putting away their wives too. You don't think lesbianism was probably a problem in Corinth? It was sexually depraved. So there could have been mass divorces. Mass divorces. And it is so hard dealing with that after. It's so hard dealing with that for so many different reasons. And Paul says, those of you who have unbelieving spouses, don't put them away. We're trying to save them. Do what you can to try to save them. Sometimes, if they want to depart, let them depart. There's nothing you can do. And if the marriage bed is defiled, and if you can't be reconciled, okay, then so be it. But we're trying to save people. That's what we're trying to do. And sometimes in marriages, what happens when marriages start splitting apart? Saving a person is not even remotely on the agenda. It's all about me. It's all about my wants. It's all about my needs. It's all about my wishes. Concern for their soul. You think most people who are going through marital difficulties, you think most people ever care about saving another person's soul, saving their spouse's soul? It's usually not on the docket. And Paul's reminding them, how do you know if you're not going to save them? So, if it's possible, stay with them. Stay with them. Render the affection due. And we're trying to save people. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to save them. And guess what? What about the kids? We're trying to save them too. Because the kids do come up in this verse. Their question involves, verse 14, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. So we're dealing with a situation where it's not just husband and wife, it's kids too. So, and pardon me, we're trying to save them too. So, as much as lieth within you, live peaceably with all men. As much as lieth within you. Sometimes not possible. If they depart, not a whole lot you can do, but we're trying to save people. So to the married, remember these verses. We're trying to save people. We're trying to save families, individuals, families. God hates divorce. The Old Testament says that. It covers one's garment with violence, I believe is what it says, or maybe bloodshed, can't remember. But it covers one's garment with violence. And a lot of times there's plenty of guilt to go around. And so he says what he says. Does any marriage, is forgiveness a part of any marriage? If it's going to last, it better be a part of the marriage. So he starts off and he says, wives, do not depart from your husbands. He didn't want mass divorces happening in Corinth. And there's a pretty good chance I would suggest it may have been an issue. So, he says what he says. Hope the study's been helpful for you as we look at the chapter. You start getting into some of these things that sometimes folks don't talk about a whole lot. They like to focus on other stuff like we talked about in the first minute or so. But let's look at the verses and try to make some application. So I hope we've done that. Hope it's been helpful for you. Have a good day. Hope everything's going well, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today.